Parents left shell-shocked after a childcare worker responsible for caring for young children is charged with dozens of child sex offences. Governments are now racing to introduce laws to safeguard the sector against predators and restore the public's broken trust. I'm Patricia Karvelas, standing in for David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The multi-billion-dollar childcare sector is facing a national reckoning after police charged childcare worker Joshua Dale Brown with 70 offences, including child rape. Brown worked in 20 daycare centres across Melbourne and Geelong over the last 8 years. The arrest of Brown and a subsequent man has rocked the country and forced the federal government to admit that they have taken too long to fix the broken system. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made greater access to childcare a key part of his re-election pitch and has introduced legislation to guarantee 3 days of subsidised early education and care universally. But the pressure is now on to make the system safe for children.
We begin with one of the most distressing child sex abuse investigations in Victoria's history.
The childcare worker accused of crimes that have sickened the community.
At as many as 20 centres across Melbourne.
Health authorities have been able to identify 1,200 children who they have recommended should get testing for infectious diseases.
And as a parent too, I can only imagine the unbearable grief and pain the affected families are experiencing right now. The Early Childhood Regulator will immediately commence an investigation.
My first reaction as a parent was disgust, to be honest.
I guess everyone's kind of asking the same question, how does that happen?
I was so panicked yesterday, looking on that list to see if any of my kids have been affected.
It has been a huge wake-up call. From here we need to see child safety and wellbeing become a national priority.
After the revelation, the accused man passed a working with children check.
And I will do everything in my power to make sure that parents can trust the system.
Every parent or anyone that has ever had to drop a child off at daycare really is reeling. And this isn't just about Melbourne, it's not about Victoria, this is rippling right across Australia.
I think any Australian who heard the news from Victoria would be sickened.
I'll introduce a piece of legislation in the first sitting fortnight that will cut off funding to childcare centres that aren't up to scratch.
A lot of these predators would pass a working with children check. They don't have anything in a history that indicates a problem.
How long have we known of the risk that something like what we've heard about in Victoria could happen in the childcare system in Australia?
Decades, James.
Ministers haven't been doing enough fast enough, right?
Including you.
Including me, and I take my fair share of responsibility for it.
There's a big urgent response in the beginning, but then recommendations don't get followed.
Education ministers are looking at tougher penalties for providers who breach safety standards, as well as the use of CCTV cameras in some centres.
Fraud officers are going to be given the power to go in and conduct these random checks on childcare centres.
They won't need a warrant, they won't need the police to come with them.
We will be backing anything that's going to make our children safer. We've backed an urgent review of the standards.
This is a moment of reckoning. It is a serious moment of reckoning.
My guest this morning is the Shadow Minister for Communication and Women, Melissa McIntosh. First, let's check what's making news. Victoria Police have charged a man following a suspicious fire at a synagogue in East Melbourne on Friday night. The 34-year-old New South Wales man was arrested by counter-terrorism police last night and charged with multiple offences, including reckless conduct endangering life. A police statement said that detectives would continue to examine the intent and ideology of the person charged to determine if the incident is in fact terrorism. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been urged to do more to protect Australia's Jewish communities following the Melbourne arson attack. Some 20 people were inside the synagogue at the time of the incident, in which flammable liquid was poured on the front door and set alight. The occupants managed to escape through the rear of the building and no one was injured. Shadow Attorney General Julian Leeser said Mr Albanese needed to follow the lead of other world leaders in lifting efforts to protect Jewish communities from anti-Semitic attacks. Meanwhile, the Israeli government says it will send a delegation to Qatar later today for talks on a ceasefire in Gaza. Hamas had earlier expressed its willingness to negotiate over the US-backed plan. And the West Australian is reporting that male workers will not change nappies in 16 Victorian childcare centres following a snap decision by Inspire Early Learning Journey on Friday. The Montessori childcare provider has become one of the first in Victoria to change its policies around what male educators can do in the classroom in the wake of Joshua Brown's arrest earlier in the week. Now, the allegations of sexual abuse in Victoria's childcare system have sent shockwaves through the community. Those who have been raising the alarm on child safety standards say red flags have been ignored by successive governments. A mix of different laws in different states means there's gaps in the system. The Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse made many significant recommendations, including for improvements in standards and working with children checks. That was delivered in 2017. The Education Minister, Jason Clare, has admitted he failed to act fast enough on childcare reforms, but has now promised to implement sweeping changes. Now, with the Albanese government making universal childcare its legacy issue, the dramatic expansion of the sector must be matched by tougher regulation. Time and time again, we've failed our most vulnerable. It's time for lasting change. Let's see what our panel makes of it. Joining us this morning, Karen Middleton, Tom Crowley, and for the first time, Miriam Corowa. Welcome to all of you. And beginning with you, Karen, a devastating story that I think has shocked the country. Melbourne parents very anxious this week. The government did step in to say it would introduce sweeping reforms. What's included in that package?
Well, what we know so far are a few things. There's already childcare legislation in train coming to the Parliament, and now obviously there'll be a big safety lens across that. So we've heard Jason Clare, as you mentioned, speak about spot checks. That was originally looking at making sure the number of kids and the number of staff matched up with what they were meant to, making sure there was no fraud. Now they will obviously have a safety lens on those as well. There's also looking again at accreditation standards and toughening those up so that when centres are receiving funding, there's a threat to remove funding if you don't meet standards, although there's still an argument about whether that is, tough enough.
Well, just on that, the Education Minister, Jason Clare, has really been, in the front and centre seat on this at the national level. He was explaining some of these reforms. Here he is.
The legislation that I'll bring to the Parliament, which is about making sure that if services aren't up to scratch, that they aren't meeting the safety and the quality standards that we expect as a country, that we have the power as a government to cut their funding off.
So they are prepared to cut the funding off. They say 70% of Commonwealth money goes to childcare and they're willing to use that power.
Indeed. And it's also important to note that the state government, the Victorian government and the Premier, Jacinta Allen, have appointed a two-person review committee to look particularly at safety standards in Victoria, where, as you say, the focus has been this past week. So there are things in train, but there's obviously now a huge focus on safety. And we are, the word reckoning has been used, but we are facing this reckoning over how we make children safer in these centres, the cost of that and the practicalities of that. Bridget McKenzie said they would support anything that makes children safer, but that's going to cost more. And people are going to have to face up to where do we want the line to be between, say, surveillance and all of that idea and the cost to keep those kids safe.
Yeah, Tom, this is the big thing. This is costly. Is that one of the reasons we've kicked this can down the road?
Look, it might be, and I think it's something that goes across a number of care sectors now. We know, I think it's one of those things that when politicians put out a media release saying, we need more childcare, we need more aged care workers, we need more disability care workers, we need more teachers, we need more healthcare professionals, we all nod our heads, we all recognise for a lot of reasons that as time goes on, we're going to need more of those. I think we all recognise that in pretty much all of those sectors, there are a lot of quality improvements that are needed as well. How you get both of those things at the same time is a really difficult problem. And I think one of the things that's become clear this week in childcare and that we saw in aged care a few years ago, much the same thing, where systems that are designed around vouchers, systems framed around the idea of individual choice. The federal government essentially doesn't directly deliver services of any kind anymore. They just say, here's your money, you go out, you choose what a good provider is, you make the decision, and in a sense, that has put regulation at arm's length. What we realised in aged care a few years ago with a lot of those stories about neglect that led to the Royal Commission was that the government actually had taken that to such an extreme that they didn't know what was happening in aged care centres and in home care providers. We're learning the same thing with childcare now, that the government really for quite a few years just doesn't know the scope of this problem. And that's something that is not a quick fix. Clearly this moment will galvanise, but it will take a long time to build that sort of quality regulation in, as we're seeing also in aged care.
But there's a crisis of confidence now, Miriam. I mean, parents are really worried about using these facilities.
And rightly so. I mean, we also need to bear in mind that there was an incredibly shocking incident that happened in Queensland not so long ago as well. And, you know, these sorts of incidents that are occurring, we're not finding out about them until, you know, it's come up in some other form, whether it's on the internet or what have you. So those checks and balances aren't in place. We also lack reportable conduct schemes in a number of jurisdictions across Australia. And who is going to be responsible for ensuring that any steps that we take at this point will actually be put in place? We don't have an early childhood commissioner at this point. So, you know, there are still a lot of questions as to how we can get this to the point where parents, families can have that confidence.
And that's the other point, isn't it, Miriam? The federal government wants to expand childcare, the universal nature of childcare. So this is quite urgent that they get this system right.
So when we come to that question of choice, you know, we've also acknowledged that so many families are living in what we call, you know, childcare deserts. You know, some 25% of families are facing very, very limited choices, if any. And so that puts them in a very, very difficult position in order to be able to say, yes, I'm confident that my child will be going somewhere where I feel that their needs are going to be taken care of. And these are young people who don't have the power to speak.
No, they don't. They don't have any agency.
No, that's right. I was going to say this is made more complicated by the fact, I think, that the government is involved in the demand side because it subsidises childcare, so it makes it more possible for people to go and look for a childcare centre. It's not involved as directly in the supply side, which is private sector, and so now they're going to have to get more involved in the supply side. And of course, they're also, you know, there's conversation about a national register of childcare workers and having, to Miriam's point about the issue in Queensland, having more visibility of people's work patterns, where they've worked, and keeping track of them, which, you know, makes it easier to track after the fact if somebody is accused of something, but hopefully has a preventative measure as well.
The other thing that I think, you can't get around this without more funding, but you also, I think, can't get around this without the most difficult thing to talk about in Australian politics, which is the federation and how do you make it work, because this is one of many areas where there's this overlap and conflict between states and territories and the federal government. This is one of those things that the federal government is the primary funder of, but a lot of the conversations about how you improve this go through the states, even though they don't have a direct role in childcare. A question, for example, there have been some calls this week once again to basically fund childcare like public schools or through public schools. You need the states for that. They're not going to be thrilled about the federal government saying, once again, can we dump another frontline service on you when you don't have any capacity to raise money yourselves and you're going to have to keep coming to us for money that we're not always going to want to give. These, across most areas of the social services, are some of the thorniest issues we confront. And in some ways, our system's actually not set up very well.
Well, the federation is often at the centre of so many of these problems, right? We found this time and time again, Miriam. Look, the Education Minister, Jason Clare, did acknowledge his own responsibility in all of this. And I think that was an important admission because we're not shocked by it. I mean, it's shocking, don't get me wrong, but there have been red flags. Our own colleague Adele Ferguson did some excellent reporting on Four Corners, which triggered the government legislation. So have they just been too slow to act?
Well, it's very interesting you make that point because we also can look to things such as the Productivity Commission's report, which has found that some 10% of centres across the sector are what we call working towards meeting standards. You know, that's an incredible number of centres. And, you know, when we see this push for 4 eyes as the standard for, you know, young children in care, how many of our child centres are actually in a position to have enough staff who are there on a regular basis so that you can form a real understanding of what's happening in that childcare centre, and that, you know, children are being supervised to the level that they need.
And then there's the elephant in the room. I mean, you know, when I was having my kids, my daughter's 16th birthday today, happy birthday, when I was having young kids, it was, you know, this kind of choice. Will you choose childcare? You talk to any young parent now, it's a false binary. There is no choice. They cannot afford their housing without putting their children in childcare. So the system hasn't kind of come up to scratch, Karen.
No, it hasn't.
In that time.
There's an economic imperative to use childcare now. And as we've said already, the Universal Childcare Pledge is about that, to make sure that everyone's got access to childcare, because it opens up the rest of the economy. You know, you can't go and get a job unless there's somewhere you can put your child. But the standards haven't kept up. Adele's reporting has highlighted that. You know, it's good and admirable that ministers are now talking about their personal experiences and the connection with this issue, but it shouldn't take that for action on these matters. Parents have been complaining, and the media reporting suggests there's been a problem for some time.
Yeah, we have seen emotional ministers. Now, ministers that get to be on the cabinet table after showing emotion, I think there's a good nexus there potentially that they toughen up this system.
Yeah, and I think it's been clear in the response at all levels of government that everyone, of course, is equal in their shock at this, and everyone is sincere in their desire to do something. I think that's been the case, you know, after, again, I mentioned aged care and the Royal Commission, genuine bipartisan effort to make a change there that's taken a lot of time. And I think these things do take time, and they have to be viewed as part of a whole system. You know, sort of kindy cops and some of the things that we're talking about this week will be significant perhaps and make a difference. But if you're just bolting that onto a system that continues to have incentives for providers to just kind of squeeze every drop of money that they can out of a childcare centre, you're going to end up with the same problem. And I think we need to talk in a big way about all of this. You mentioned housing there, PK. We have this grand problem, all different types of care we're going to need more of. We recognise the workers are underpaid and undervalued, and we need more of them. We also recognise we need to be able to have enough money to make it high quality. We've got to do all of that with a lot of public money when it's very hard to talk about raising money. The budget's not in great shape, and that's going to fall on the shoulders of young people as the population ages. It relates to housing, it relates to everything. This is the biggest problem that faces us.
It's such a great point. It's all very much linked. Time now to talk to the Shadow Communications Minister, Melissa McIntosh. To take us there, here was the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollands, responding to this week's shocking allegations.
Places where some of the most vulnerable children in our country are supposed to be looked after have been at risk for decades because we have not acted on those recommendations. We know what to do. It has been a lack of accountability and a lack of prioritising children that has been what's held us back.
Melissa McIntosh, welcome to Insiders.
Thank you.
Are Australian children safe in our childcare system?
I think the government's number one job, any government, is to protect Australians, to protect our citizens. And these are our youngest Australians, vulnerable. They're babies. Something is going very wrong. And I sit before you this morning, first and foremost, as a mum who has 3 children who went through childcare. And I had to get on a train at 6 o'clock in the morning and travel an hour to the city, and my children were in daycare all day. And this is the story of women right across the country. We have trust in our childcare centres. We have trust in the people that are looking after our children. It's not that we're choosing to put them there because we want to. We have to work. We have to, as you said, we have to be able to afford a living, to afford housing. There is something seriously wrong, and every single parent in this country has a right to be very angry and to be asking serious questions right now of our politicians, all of our politicians, including myself.
Yeah, well, because there are successive governments that have failed. In fact, the previous Morrison government received the institutional abuse report, which said that some of these things had to happen. Do you think that government was also dropped the ball? The current government's taken responsibility. Was the previous government also responsible?
We've had review after review. We've had a Royal Commission. We could go back in time to say that, of course, successive governments should have done more. But right now, we've had a serious case of abuse of young children, including babies. And the government, the Albanese government, has said itself that it has been too slow to act. Why? Why has it been so slow to act? Why have we seen multiple accounts of child sex abuse take place before the government and all politicians get upset, cry on television and say this is so bad, when we've had these reviews and we've had parents calling out for change, we've had advocates calling for change. Something should have been done before now.
Now, your side of politics has said that you're providing bipartisan support to the government. The government's told us that they want to put federal officers with the power to carry out spot checks. They want to have the right to take funding away from centres, but they haven't yet said that they'll introduce a national childcare commission to act as a watchdog. That is in the Productivity Commission's report, a version of that. Do we need that? A watchdog with teeth?
We want the government to look at every single measure possible, quickly as well, and we'll back any reasonable measure. When it comes to child checks, so the checks that you need to do before you work in a childcare centre, are they thorough enough? Are they happening once? Do they happen? How many times do they happen? And as we know, it is state-based, so it's not centralised in a national system. Why is that? So I think every parent out there would think that is a logical thing to at least have when it comes to checks around the acceptability of people to work in our centres. But yes, you're right, there are many things that could happen.
Does it trouble you that centres can receive money if they're just working towards being at standard?
That means they're not at standard. And where are the checks? What's happening to these centres when they're not at standard? And this is not just about abuse of children, this is about the standard overall of a centre. I think more needs to be done there, more needs to be done around the workforce. And of course, as you said, the government has this mandate to increase childcare in this country, to have more children in childcare. Why is that their top priority? Their top priority should be the safety of our children.
Do you think they should hold back on expanding the sector until you're satisfied, or, you know, there is a satisfaction that the sector is a safe place for our children?
We shouldn't even be talking about whether the sector is a safe place for our children. I think every parent out there would be aghast to think that that is the thing that we're talking about, the safety of our children. We're putting our care in others, our trust in people that have broken that trust, they've destroyed that trust. I think the government needs to really look at that as a priority as they work towards increasing they should be able to do both.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I want to move to your portfolio if we can, the women part of your portfolio. You got pre-selected in a marginal seat, but would it be so bad to have more women around you at the cabinet, shadow cabinet table or in the parliament that got there with the help of quotas?
I think every Liberal seat in the country is a marginal seat right now, but my feelings around quotas is at the talk that we're having in the media oversimplifies the issue, which is around the culture in the Liberal Party and how women are treated in the Liberal Party. I think first and foremost we need to have an investigation as part of the review of the election and of the Liberal Party into the culture. What are the pathways for a woman from the grassroots through to leadership? We should be looking at mentorship programs. We should be looking at those pathways. Possibly we could look at gender balance in candidate pools to make sure that women are at least in the pre-selection process. But right now, people can't get people into branches within the Liberal Party. We're being blocked. I had 2 attempts to take me out as a sitting member of Parliament by blokes very aggressively. So until the culture is addressed, we could have all the quotas in the world, but it will be a revolving door of women.
Okay, but how do you change the culture? How do you intend to do that? How can the party change the culture in a way that's meaningful?
I think that we need to be looking to the experts that have gone into other organisations to review the culture. It needs to be an organisational redesign, I think, done by professionals, done by experts. It's too important to be relying on instinct or people's ideology. This is not a conservative versus moderate issue. This is about the future and the sustainability of the Liberal Party. Everyone agrees, I believe, that we do need more representation of women in the Liberal Party, in our parliaments, and that helps ensure that we have policies that appeal to Australian women too.
I understand you want it to be broader than just quotas, but you're not opposed to quotas.
I think that we need to be looking at every single mechanism right now. And when I think about quotas, I think first and foremost we could be looking at gender balance in the candidate pre-selection process, at least getting that right. We're going from having not very much at all to quotas. There's a lot in between, and without the culture being addressed, without cultural change, as I said, quotas won't go anywhere.
David Cameron in the UK did something similar, the A-list as it was known. Critics, though, say it ultimately hasn't worked as fast as it should. 2 decades after it was introduced, I think female representation rose to 24% by 2024 last year. 24%'s not good enough, is it?
We need to be looking at what works for the Liberal Party of Australia in an Australian context. We had a high number of women in 1996, the Howard era, but shortly after that, those women were out of Parliament because they were in marginal seats. So traditionally, women have been running in marginal seats, but ensuring that women can sustain a career as a parliamentarian, as I said to you just now, on the first occasion after the first election and I increased my margin, there was attempts to take me out. So it's a cultural issue that is allowed to happen. There's systemic issues within the Liberal Party that means that a female marginal seat holder can lose her seat because of internal warfare.
One idea is to have a sunset clause on quotas. I think that deals with some of the issues around some people's concerns around them. Is that something you support?
As I said, I think the discussion on quotas right now just really oversimplifies the issue of a need for cultural change. We should be looking at every single mechanism. Yes, let's look at quotas. Why shouldn't we?
Angus Taylor has basically suggested that they can be undemocratic. Do you see it that way?
I see it right now where we are in the depths of opposition, where we have lost great women in the party, in the parliamentary ranks, when we do have low numbers in the House of Representatives. We shouldn't be saying no to any mechanism. If people don't like it, let's still have that debate. That's what it's about in the Liberal Party.
I just want to move to some of your portfolio issues. There is a lot going on in the communications portfolio. eSafety has released some research showing 37% of young people have encountered harmful content on YouTube. YouTube was exempt from the under-16 social media ban. The recommendation to government is that it's included. Do you think YouTube should be in the social media ban?
Yeah, stepping this back a little bit, when Peter Dutton was opposition leader, it was a coalition that made the call to do something about harmful content online, what kids are exposed to. And I just said I'm a parent, but this is what matters about protecting our children. Once again, we're going back to government policies and failures when it comes to protecting Australian children. This time it's about protecting Australian children online. So we're waiting now. The government decided to put forward legislation after a lot of pushing from the coalition and advocacy groups, but there is an exemption for YouTube. Why is it? Let's say it's on educational grounds, but now you see some of the other platforms putting out that they've got educational components too. It is up to the government now
they haven't
to come to a resolution.
yet. Do you think they should put it in?
Of course.
Yeah.
No, I'm saying, of course, they need to respond. They need to get this right for our Australian children.
But if the eSafety Commission is recommending it based on research, that means they should include it, shouldn't they?
It's a logical thing to do. It makes it complex when there's some platforms that are out and then there's some that are in. If that's going to be the case, it needs to be clear to Australian families why that's the case, because once again, it's our Australian kids that we need to be protecting first and foremost.
Just a couple of other issues. The gambling ban that the late Labor MP Peter Murphy called for. It's 2 years old now, that recommendation. Peter Dutton did announce first, but it's true, before Labor, a partial ban, but it wasn't the full ban. Now that you're reviewing all your policies, is it something you're prepared to do?
Once again, it's 2 years since that landmark report. The Albanese government hesitated on putting anything out before the election. There was a lot of pushback by industry, and we had our policy to ban gambling advertising during live sports, an hour before, during and an hour after, to protect Australian families. Well, we're going to be reviewing all our policies. I think that was a really strong policy. I think the government It's got that policy there. Why don't you implement that?
But it doesn't go as far as what the recommendation was, though, which is a blanket ban.
I think there needs to be, one of the other recommendations was a strategy, a gambling strategy, I guess, for the government to pick up. And I hate to recommend another review for the government to do because every single topic that you've talked to me about today has been stuck in a review. If it's childcare, it's stuck in review phase. If it's online safety, it's stuck in a review phase. The government needs to start getting on with things.
Now, the news bargaining incentive was announced in December. Basically, it's like a tax on the big tech companies if they don't come to deals with the media companies to fund journalism. When do you want to see this happen?
Here's another review. We're waiting for the government on their position with the negotiations around bringing all the platforms to the table. This is around protecting Australian news content and ensuring that big multinational platforms pay for the content that is on their platform. We were really strong on that when we were in government, the coalition, saying that we're not going to be bullied by these big international companies.
But they then withdrew from your deal, and so the government's come up with an alternative. Is it a good alternative, and should they get on with implementing it?
Well, the government needs to get on with implementing what they've promised, and right now we're all waiting. The platforms are waiting, and most importantly, the news organisations, not only big news organisations, but our smaller independent organisations that are reliant on money.
Some of them are losing deals already.
They're losing deals, there's uncertainty, they're losing staff. This was to help also protect, balanced journalism in Australia, investigative journalism, and to ensure that we maintain that really strong part of our democracy, which is so important.
Just finally, a really disturbing story on Friday night. It's led to one arrest already for an alleged arson attack. An arson attack happened, but somebody has now been arrested. There's also a restaurant attack that was an Israeli restaurant in Melbourne. So a spate of anti-Jewish attacks. Prime Minister says the full force of the law should be used to come down on all perpetrators. Isn't that the right response?
Why are we in this position? Attack like this on the Jewish community, as abhorrent as it is also an attack on all Australians. It's an attack on our values. It's an attack on our social cohesion. There are wonderful Jewish people right through our history that have contributed to making Australia the place it is today, including wonderful Jessica Fox in my community. Mum's Jewish, including my former colleague Josh Frydenberg, people that have made contributions in sport, in politics, in philanthropy, doing so much. And this isn't an isolated attack. This has been ongoing. Something needs to be done. Excuse me.
That's all right. It is, and the community is quite fearful. But all of the resources of counter-terrorism and the police are there. What more could the government do?
What is the government
What could they do?
There's been a letter that's been sitting there for 3 weeks from the Leader of the Opposition, Susan Lee, from Andrew Hastie, the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, and from Julian Leeser, imploring the government to protect the Jewish community.
They've already offered more security funding, though.
All of that in light of what's been going on in the Middle East, and they have not received a response from the Prime Minister. What about National Cabinet? Why isn't he convening National Cabinet and bringing the states together with urgency to address this issue? There's a number of things that the government could be doing, yet we're sitting here today discussing another horrible attack where there are kids inside the synagogue. The person lit the synagogue, a place of worship when families were inside. That is such a disgusting attack, a hateful attack on Australians.
Melissa McIntosh, thank you so much for joining us on Insiders.
Thank you.
And coming up with the panel, we will be discussing Penny Wong's visit to Washington, D.C. this week. She met with her counterpart, Marco Rubio. Also, the Prime Minister gave a significant speech last night. We'll be talking about that as well. But let's see what the panel makes of it. Karen Middleton, Tom Crowley and Miriam Corowa. Really interesting comments there from Melissa McIntosh, talked about a range of things. But let's just go to those spate of attacks on Friday night. The opposition's suggesting, as you heard there from Melissa McIntosh, the Prime Minister should step up, National Cabinet should be convened. Where are we at? I mean, this was obviously a really frightening night for the Jewish community, and they're really quite shell-shocked from the experience.
It's terrifying, and I can completely understand the Jewish community feeling terrified. Went through this last year. Now these things are happening again. What is unclear to me, though, is what is being sought from the government and where the limit is for what the government can do to stop people who are bent on violent responses. How do you stop a bunch of people who decide they want to run into a restaurant, or someone who wants to firebomb the premises? Of course, increasing security and all of those things, but in the end, are we expecting too much of governments in some respects? I understand the sentiment of wanting government to be speaking publicly about it, to asserting it itself absolutely as much as possible. But I do wonder whether, where the line is of what is practical that a government can do.
The Shadow Attorney General, Julian Leeser, was out pretty quickly after all of this was being reported yesterday. Here he is.
We saw world leaders saying we need to step up security for the Jewish community given this conflict that's going on there. But our government never said anything, and we wanted to put the Prime Minister on notice that he needed to do what other world leaders have done. And I don't know that he's done all he can here, and it's for him to answer those questions.
Okay, so it's for him to answer those questions. Just on that, he did stand up before he delivered his speech last night, the John Curtin speech, and he spoke pretty strongly on this. Here he is.
It is to be hoped that the perpetrator is brought to justice urgently and that he faces the full force of the law, and anyone involved in this attack faces the full force of the law.
And maybe there are practical things that can be done, and sure, the government should look at that. I suppose what I'm saying is, where's the limit of the practical things in the end?
Yeah, and I think, there was a media release this morning from Tony Burke and Anne Ali suggesting that more security funding might be something the government would look at if needed. That was something that was provided last year, but I recall there being some discussions about the scope of it and the amount of it.
Well, the Prime Minister made it clear even last night in his statement that any requests would be,
that's right.
He's not suggesting he's not going to take action. But Miriam, there is frustration still from the Jewish community that more needs to be done. They are a community that feels like they are being held to account for a government's action very far away. It's a difficult position to be in.
These are shocking events, and it's not just the one event that happened as well on that evening on Friday, and I think that compounds obviously the gravity of what happened at the synagogue in particular. We saw also, the protests that went into the restaurant as well in Melbourne. That was quite frightening for people who are patrons there. And we also saw another incident involving graffiti and cars being burnt. So, I can understand exactly, why the sense around what needs to be done is even more heightened. We have obviously seen initiatives such as, we have those envoys who have been appointed to help, guide community conversation and to look into how we, thread more of a cohesive conversation, I suppose, as a community in light of what is happening in those global events, which we are seeing now being played out domestically here in Australia. But, the threads of who is exactly responsible for what, that is the big challenge.
And I think ultimately, I think that, I guess to go to Karen's point, I think there's an opportunity for us here to resist the temptation that we had in the last term of government to immediately frame this in the context of federal politics and the bipartisan political contest. There was a reason that was the case in the last term, because it was so stark, the difference in what the two parties were saying. Peter Dutton, clearly saw it as a campaign issue. The polls were very tight. There were a lot of reasons, I think, why the federal political conversation was a live one. Sometimes, though, I think over the course of the last few years, that has caused us to skip over the part where we grieve collectively and where we just process this as a community and respond to it as a community. So whether, I think it's clear now that issues like security and essentially whatever is required on a policy front, there seems to be a bipartisan appetite for it.
That's right, but it's not just about securitising it. That's important. But we are now in a situation where Jewish people at Shabbat on a Friday night in inner Melbourne have had their place of worship, an attempted arson. It is unthinkable that this would be happening in Australia.
And what the Jewish community is rightly seeking is reassurance that the government has their back. And that is now the challenge for the government, to find a way to reassure the whole community, and particularly the Jewish community, that they do have their back, and not let this escalate into the kind of politics that we saw that was so damaging and divisive, and that really only ends up exacerbating more violence, I think, that we saw in the last term of government.
And just to note, I mean, the protesters or whoever, like, we don't know, there's lots of different debates here, but, you know, this is meant to be about the war in Gaza, which is clearly a very devastating war. We are, it looks like, potentially on the cusp of what could be a ceasefire. We'll just park that because, you know, it's developing, with Israeli officials going to Qatar to, you know, and Hamas has also said that they want to advance this as well. But, you know, there is what some people are very passionate about, and then Miriam taking it out on individuals in our community, which seems to me a very strange thing to do. And very, very unhelpful in a multicultural country like this.
Absolutely. This is not something that we should ever countenance, and it should have, you know, the strongest possible response. I totally understand, you know, the importance of that, but also the messaging that we have around that. I think, you know, that point about reassurance, you know, the community needs to know that they are a priority, and that, you know, they understand what sort of resources are being put towards this. And we also have seen other steps being taken recently to address this in terms of, you know, changes to hate speech and what have you. We really want to send the message to community that we need
Well, the government has already strengthened the law, and that's the point that Tony Burke has made, and he's going to be speaking at 11 o'clock today. So they've actually taken some action here. I think that's what they've been trying to highlight. Obviously, a lot more work to do, though.
Absolutely.
Especially with community sentiment, if this is going on, even if it's at the fringes. Look, I want to change the topic and talk about something that landed this week after years of work, which is incredibly significant, I think, for our country, and that's the Yoorrook Justice Commission and its final 100 recommendations. Lots of different ideas there, but one of the findings, Miriam, which was quite I think stark and painful for Indigenous Australians, but that a genocide had occurred. Just walk me through how significant this moment was.
Look, it is a very potent moment. It comes with a lot of possibility and potential for healing, but it also depends very much on how the community as a whole responds to what this process has been in terms of the Commission and the findings. That statement around, you know, the unfolding of colonialism in Victoria involving systematic acts which amount to genocide was a really important moment in terms of the degree of loss and suffering that has happened for First Nations people in Victoria. The devastation from, you know, an estimated 60,000 people to just 2,000 people in a matter of decades. I mean, you know, we just need to acknowledge that, you know, we now have on the public record a document which charts that history, those incidents, which has brought in a really inclusive process for having those conversations with descendants of people who went through that time. And I note as well, non-Indigenous people as a part of this. Susanna Henty, you know, a descendant of one of the key people mentioned as a perpetrator, has spoken to the Commission and given her perspectives now as someone who is, you know, a descendant and what she would hope for. So, you know, I think it's a really important point that we understand that we've made an acknowledgement around acts that have happened. What is the next step?
And some of the next steps are that the first assembly be, you know, a permanent feature, that it can design policy. Now, I saw Brad Batten, who's the opposition leader's response, and it did sound to me like, if I can just, a little Peter Dutton-esque in you know, he talked about it like it's the same as the referendum and the Voice, Karen. There were sort of some similarities there in what we heard.
I think the risk here is, given the what happened with the Voice referendum and the kind of nature of the debate that emerged through that and the resounding vote against what was proposed, that there could be a sense of, well, we don't need to listen to these findings, that there's not popular support. I think that would be a misinterpretation of the Voice referendum result. We've already seen the Liberal Party reckoning with a misunderstanding of what that result may have represented in their whole election campaign.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be careful not to misrepresent that and not to amplify necessarily the people who automatically say we don't have to listen. These are factual findings. I was quite struck by, in fact, a comment that Jill Gallagher made, the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation chair. She said, "We don't blame anyone alive today for these atrocities, but it's the responsibility of those of us alive today to accept the truth and recognise and reconcile with these factual findings." So she's saying these have historical roots. It's incremental, intergenerational acceptance of norms that have caused great wrong and great suffering to people. And what we must do now is reconcile with that and work out how we respond.
Now, the former federal Indigenous Affairs Minister that was part of promising the Makarrata, the truth-telling federally, Linda Burney, was on the Insiders on Background podcast this week, the David Lipson. Here she is.
You know, the meaning of genocide perfectly fits the story of what happened to people, not just in Victoria, but around the country. When you think of the various policies that existed for Aboriginal people, including extermination and assimilation, then it pretty much fits the bill as far as I'm concerned.
So, Miriam, it fits the bill.
Well, indeed. You know, it's quite a weighty body of work. It's more than one volume. There is the piece which was the Truth Be Told document, which is part of the public record now, and then there were those subsequent documents which were the summary reports, which contained those key findings, the recommendations, and a lot of the process around the commission. So we look to a vast array of 100 recommendations from this report. We also need to acknowledge that there were the 46 recommendations of the interim report, and at this stage we've only seen the Victorian government say that it's behind 6 of those 46. We'll have to wait and see around those 100.
And it's a really difficult challenge, I think, for the Victorian government, which in a sense is the canary in the coal mine now for governments around the country that are looking at what does reconciliation look like after the Voice.
Yeah. To
answer this question of which of the recommendations do they think they can win hearts and minds and take forward, because I think, you know, it's certainly true that the Voice doesn't, you know, preclude any further reconciliation, but the thunderous rejection of it does show you what happens if you're not able to build public will around these things.
Yeah.
It's a difficult challenge.
Now, just changing the topic if we can. This week was significant. The Foreign Minister was in Washington, D.C. meeting with Marco Rubio, her counterpart, and that was, I think, an important meeting. The Prime Minister last night, though, gave a pretty significant speech. The speech was basically, you know, about the legacy of John Curtin. It was a pretty significant speech, I think. He made a speech last night at the John Curtin Research Centre. He referenced the former Labor Prime Minister's decision during World War II to align Australia more closely with the US. Here he is.
So we remember Curtin not just because he looked to America. We honour him because he spoke for Australia and for Labor. That independence has never meant isolationism. Choosing our own way doesn't mean going it alone.
Okay, so pretty significant message.
Really interesting positioning. And look, there's the long Labor tradition that goes beyond John Curtin. Paul Keating, of course, was so big at talking about Australia as standing on its own 2 feet within Asia. Kevin Rudd as well, who's very much within the tent, liked to talk about Australia as a middle power. So it's not surprising, and it is though interesting to see Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong trying to position Australia in that trend. It's deliberate. The Prime Minister still, after the election, is making some wink-wink, nudge-nudge jokes about Donald Trump being a little bit crazy. I don't think he's too fussed about the perception that they're not best mates and that it's taken a little while to get a meeting. But there's a massive contradiction, of course, with the strategic policy, with the defence policy that is entirely hitched to America with AUKUS. So the words are one thing, but it's kind of out of step with the fact that we need America at the moment. We are probably going to have to get this meeting.
Well, that's a very important point. Look, you know, the Prime Minister was asked about 3,000 times, I'm exaggerating, but seriously, about the meeting with Donald Trump. He suggested to me that it might happen at the Quad meeting in India later this year. This has really dogged him. Someone who did get a meeting though, Penny Wong, met with Marco Rubio. She said defence wasn't raised and clearly came back. We don't have a deal on tariffs either. Looks like that 10% tariff will stay.
Well, that's the way it looks at the moment. I mean, those two ministers in the foreign policy area were clearly staying in their lane and not getting into the defence lane. But I think what the outcome of those talks tells you is that it's Donald Trump, the president, who calls the shots on these tariffs. And I think so. Whether the Prime Minister likes to talk about it or not, and he clearly doesn't, and he's quite annoyed that people keep asking about a meeting. And I understand he doesn't want it reduced to, the argument reduced to...
Well, he says it's about the outcome, not the meeting.
Correct. And of course, it suits the opposition to make it all about the meeting because they can say he's failing, you know, in our relationship. It is important that he gets a meeting with Donald Trump. It is important that that he gets to know the president because that is clearly the way that Donald Trump operates, and Australia does need America, but he also wants to make the point about how much America needs Australia in a security sense in particular, in an economic sense as well. So there are, you know, it's two-way and it's a difficult discussion to have in public, but that speech last night was interesting because he gave a specific example from World War II where Australia defied the United States and the UK. They wanted to send Australian forces to what was then Burma, Myanmar. The Australian Prime Minister said, no, we're not doing that. He argued that had he agreed, Australians would have been overrun and hundreds would have been killed. So he's making a point that is Australia first.
Yeah, he is. It's an Australia... And Miriam, look, it's not lost on anyone that the Trump administration, the US alliance, is incredibly unpopular among voters, right?
Well, it's interesting that we're talking about the question of whether Albanese will be meeting with Trump, but we also understand that Albanese will be meeting with Xi Jinping. And so when we come to these questions around the bigger picture for Australia in terms of trade in particular, it's not lost on anyone that China is our biggest trading partner. That's also a very important relationship. And so, you know, that dance, if you like, on the global stage in terms of defence with Australia being so closely aligned with the United States and the United Kingdom, particularly around AUKUS and the submarines. That is one factor, but we also need to acknowledge that we have other things that we're also attending to as core business as a country. And so that's another important
and that's
the tariff conversation is important, but ultimately not that important. Doesn't matter that much. Defence. It's all about this 3.5
Well, the AUKUS review is on.
Number.
And we'll see
That's
where that
where it'll
goes.
end up.
Our panel will be back in a moment with final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for the New Daily. I'm talking pictures this morning with political reporter for Nine, Amanda Copp, and a very warm welcome back.
G'day, Mike. Good to be back.
Amanda, it's a penny for your thoughts as the Foreign Minister travelled to Washington to figure out how they're thinking, and a lovely Warren cartoon titled Spending a Penny.
And we've got Penny here, and trust me, Marco, we've upped defence expenditure like you wouldn't believe.
I know, and it's an FJ Holden armoured car, which is rather cool. I'd like one of them. Lovely little Australia there. Very nice.
I also quite like this bit here, the number plate. AUS, investing in defence like we used to invest in the car industry.
I love this cartoon by Peter Brolman. Kevin Rudd's tied up in the corner. It's the new version of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
It sure is. Poor old Kevin. He's not going to get much done as ambassador if he's tied up over there.
Wong, Rubio didn't ask about Rudd.
So where is the Australian ambassador?
You don't want to ask. I'm Kevin, I'm from Queensland and I'm not here to help. A rather dystopian view of America at the moment that David Pope has done for us here, postcard from the US summer camp. It seems to be suggesting from global warming to misinforming.
Yeah, we've got Penny Wong here with a 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah.
All of these things here, CI satellite data, global change research program, really just the US burning up anything to do with climate change.
Yeah, then you sandwich it between a couple of mega crackers, but I guess you could use Anzac cookies instead.
Yeah, roasting everything on the altar to King Trump up here.
That's rather good. Amanda, the US is one of our strongest allies, but the PM seems to be having a bit of trouble getting a meeting with Trump.
He sure is.
Lovely David Rowe cartoon, the Trump storm here blowing up and inverting the umbrella that Anthony Albanese's holding.
Yeah, it's certainly an enter at your own peril with the Trump administration at the moment.
Yeah. G'day, Penny. What's that? Sorry, must be a bad crackle. Dinner with Kevin. Stay safe, Penny. Penny, you there? Click.
Albo's having a bit of trouble here getting through to Penny, but Penny and Albo are having a bit of trouble getting through to this guy.
Lovely Mark Knight cartoon here, Amanda. It's not so much the White House as the Fight House.
It sure is, and we've got the hot seat over here. Definitely something you wouldn't really want to be sitting on.
Warmed and ready for the next victim.
I think it's a little bit more than warm.
Yeah, it's red hot. We've got JD and Pete Hegseth here with the boxing gloves on.
Ready to punch on in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And this little bit I love, George Washington here. Eek!
Looking very shocked. Badiou Chow has drawn the Chinese ambassador to Australia, Xiao Chen. He's channeling
Dr. Evil.
Dr. Evil. Dear Australia, defence spending is bad for you. He needs a white cat to be patting.
I know, he's almost convincing us that, you know, maybe it wouldn't be good to keep on spending.
Yeah. Lovely Megan Herbert cartoon, The Science of Political Climate Change. Got Stockdale and Angus Taylor and Dan Tian and Matt Canavan here.
There's really a lot going on.
Yeah, there is. Here she is shining the new light of the Liberal Party.
New leadership ideas radiate down on the earth.
Yeah.
Some are absorbed, some disappear into the ether, and
the rest are trapped by man-made emissions in increasingly damaging feedback loops, locking in irreversible political climate breakdown. Women are sufficiently assertive.
Quotas subvert democracy.
Renewals will trash the economy.
No net zero. Remember when we said that the climate wars were over?
Yeah. Unhelpful emissions, these could be classed as, I think. Lovely Fiona Katauskas cartoon has got the Liberal pre-selection test and the 2 girls and 1 boy.
If it really is merit-based, then why do you get bonus points for XY chromosomes and being able to pee standing up, Mike? In the House of Representatives at the moment, there's going to be single digits of Liberal women on the floor.
Well, Fiona seems to be suggesting they're putting the member back in Member of Parliament.
Ooh, not going to go there, Mike.
A lovely Matt Golding. I really love this. What's a few letters in quotas? From status quotas to status quo.
What's the definition of insanity, Mike? Just keep doing the same thing and hoping for a different outcome.
Over and over and over again.
Over again.
It's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours, Amanda.
Thanks, Mike. Back to you, PK.
Thank you. Time for final observations. Miriam.
Well, happy NAIDOC is my final observation. I do acknowledge as well it's been a particularly challenging time for First Nations people, the Yoorrook Commission report being handed down, but also a number of coronial findings being delivered, including tomorrow for Kumanjai Walker. But at this time, the theme being next generation, strength, vision and legacy. I think there's a lot for us to draw on from our communal collective spirit and that focus on dignity and striving towards a better future for all of us. So NAIDOC, it's a time for us to all to come together and to celebrate those things that, you know, bring us together as a community and make us stronger for the future. So that's a reflection for me.
Beautifully said, and it's a really important theme too about the future generation. Tom?
As the roundtable, the reform roundtable approaches with tax on the agenda, we're playing the ceremonial rule in, rule out game a lot, and I understand why everyone likes it.
I thought that was banned.
We were banned, but it's still happening, PK. I think the GST component of this is a little bit of a red herring, though. Don't get sucked into the GST. I think it's pretty clear now the government doesn't have much interest in that. Look elsewhere for potential tax reform. 3 that I would name: trusts, road user charging, and what was the third one again? Some broad taxation of savings. I think they're the spaces with a little less baggage that the government might look if it wants to do some tax reform.
Interesting. Karen?
The childcare debate, the difficult debate we've been having, has also touched on things like the role of surveillance in childcare centres. It will get to the role of surveillance powers for police and investigators. There was a law passed 5 years ago that gave the federal police more intrusive surveillance powers for serious crimes, particularly child sex offences. That is due to sunset next year. It has to be reviewed by the Parliament between now and then. We've also got the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor about to hand a report to government reviewing those powers. So that's going to be a very interesting debate to watch, whether police think they need more powers or how well they've been used in the light of the debate we're having about childcare.
Yeah, very interesting. Oh, it was wonderful having you all on the couch with me. Thank you so much. Finally, it's winter in Canberra, which means it's pretty cold. So spare a thought for the first pooch, Toto, and for the press pack who had to endure this story from the Prime Minister. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Let me tell you, at 5:30, it was very, very, very cold. And my recalcitrant dog was like, I'm not going out there for the morning what you got to do. Anyway,
Okay.
Where are we going?
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.